Hello. In the last video presentation, Hayek versus Keynes, we examined the historical debate between Friedrich Hayek and John Maynard Keynes on what to do about the problem of recession. You may recall that Friedrich Hayek was an Austrian economist who studied under Ludwig von Mises in what is now known as the Austrian School of Economic Thought. The Austrian school and the classical school of economic thought take their roots in the works of Adam Smith and other free market economists who argued, by way of review, that if the economy goes into recession, the economy has a built-in self-correcting mechanism whereby over time businesses begin to put downward pressure on wages and other input costs until aggregate supply begins to once again grow, restoring full employment at lower price levels than before. You also recall that when the Great Depression hit, many Americans and political officials began to argue that John Maynard Keynes was correct in that the self-correcting mechanism could not work for such a severe downturn. Therefore, the Keynesians and the nations that began to follow the Keynesian orthodoxy argued that massive increases in government spending on infrastructure programs could help rebuild the economy and restore full employment. Today we're going to take a look at the period of 1971 running through today to examine the Hayek and Keynesian debate surrounding the problem of stagflation that began to emerge in the early 1970s. You'll recall in the last video that Friedrich Hayek had written a book entitled The Road to Serfdom, warning the United States and Great Britain and any other country that would pursue socialistic, expansionist government policies that in the long run, the more money the government takes from the private sector to spend on what the government sees fit in the name of job creation and economic growth, and in the long run, the more the government regulates business and industry and individuals, or in the long run, the more the government nationalizes the key industries, whether it be coal, rail, and steel in the 40s, or healthcare, banking, and the automobile industry today, that in the long run, the effects of higher taxes, greater regulation, and quasi or total nationalization of key industries would lead to a dramatic drop in the productivity of a country. It would lead to much higher input costs. It would lead to a sluggishness that would do away with the Keynesian argument that government spending in the long run is a boost to economic activity. But for 3 decades, it appeared that Keynes was right and Hayek was wrong. Everybody believed that World War II proved that Keynes was right, that government spending on armaments could restore full employment and lead to as Keynes called, a grand new experiment with government spending and government planning and government regulating. During the rest of the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, we saw relatively strong economic growth in the United States of America. In fact, the growth during some periods of time with this sort of public-private partnership between Keynesian micromanaging of the economy and the mixed economy of capitalism and free markets, we saw on occasion that growth would be at such a level where John Maynard Keynes was now asked what to do about the problem of aggregate demand growing too much. Just to mention the problem of inflation briefly, Keynes recommended during the time of the 40s, 50s, and 60s that if aggregate demand ever increased too much, that the solution for this problem was for the government to increase taxes. You may recall reading in your book the complaints by former President Ronald Reagan that when he was working as an actor in Hollywood in the 1950s, that he was in the 94% tax bracket. You recall watching the video lecture by John F. Kennedy when he called for tax cuts, that when Kennedy was president, the top income tax rate was 91%. John Maynard Keynes argued that in an economy plagued by too much aggregate demand, by raising income taxes and other taxes, you would cool off aggregate demand. You would bring aggregate demand back down towards full employment. You would discourage people from engaging in what could be called conspicuous consumption on too many toys and swimming pools and motorcycles and vacations and other things that are frivolous, according to the Keynesians. And it would encourage people, by having less take-home pay, to work more hours, to work longer and harder in order to be able to maintain their standard of living. So, in effect, as a footnote to what we're doing today, we did see during the 3 decades of Keynesian economics, when the economy would slow, government would step up spending, and even when the economy wasn't slow, government would spend money on everything from the space program to the interstate highway program of the 1950s. But we saw growing government spending overall, and when the economy perked up too much on the aggregate demand side of the equation, we saw ever-increasing taxes on businesses and individuals. All of this ran contrary to the classical way of looking at economic issues. The classics believed that whenever there was a problem of inflation, that if you just left the economy alone over time, if aggregate demand increased too much, you would have prices starting to increase, and eventually workers would start to get pay raises, suppliers would start to raise their prices, and as wages and other input costs were bid up, you would see a decrease in aggregate supply back to full employment. So even during periods of inflation, the classical Austrian school of economic thought argued that the best way to manage the economy is to not manage the economy, but let it work out its own problems, with the constant warning that growth in government over time would eventually cause an economic collapse. In 1971, we began to see Hayek's predictions about taxes and regulation and the nationalization of industry come true. So at this time, we're going to take a look at a short video of what was taking place in the United States of America, Great Britain, and other places that had been experimenting with Keynesian economics for 30 years, what was beginning to take place that puzzled economists and politicians alike. Let's take a look.
When Hayek moved back to his native Austria, he was depressed. The success of mixed economies made his free market theories, and Hayek himself, seem more irrelevant than ever.
The world was very much a socialist world. His ideas were not fashionable. Nobody seemed to listen to him. Nobody seemed to agree with him. He was alone.
Hayek found his ideas shunned by the academic world.
Well, most of the departments became dislike me, so much so that I can feel it to the present day. That economists thought very largely tend to treat me as an outsider.
He was living in a provincial town and stuck in a rut. But the outside world was beginning to change. Skimming the newspaper in his usual restaurant, Hayek read how inflation and unemployment were rising at the same time. There was a new word to describe it: stagflation. After 30 glorious years of growth, the American economy was in trouble.
The economy basically was kind of going nowhere and had inflation, which didn't seem to get cured, and kind of a malaise in the economy.
Stagflation was the end of naive Keynesianism. You had two things at the same time, which under the Keynesian view would have been impossible. You had stagnation in the economy, a high level of unemployment. You had inflation with prices rising rapidly.
President Nixon looked like a Chicago economist's dream come true. Milton Friedman was a special advisor, and George Shultz was in charge of the budget.
About the wholesale price index a moment ago. One of the big areas where prices were going up at wholesale very rapidly was lumber and other materials associated with home building.
But the president wasn't listening. He tried to spend his way out of trouble.
Going to wind up having its impact on the cost.
To add insult to injury, he declared, "Now I'm a Keynesian."
This declaration by Nixon horrified his conservative supporters. Indeed, one congressman wrote him, said, "Mr. President, I'm going to have to burn all of my old speeches." And Nixon wrote back to him, "I will too."
Nixon decided he hadn't gone far enough. So he took his top economic advisors off to Camp David for a working weekend. Ben Stein, the quiz show host, was a junior speechwriter in the White House, and his father was at the meeting.
Here's my father walking into the president's cabin to meet Mr. Nixon, and there's George Shultz right behind him. I'm not sure, but I think it's a fair bet that any one of these meetings, they're complaining about something being wrong. Probably talking about prices and stagflation. I'm not sure.
Dick Cheney was a young aide at the time.
I always remember a debate we had during the Nixon administration when the public was convinced that food prices were going up. So the political debate was whether or not we should impose a freeze on food prices.
The supposedly conservative Republican Nixon opted for wage and price controls.
Nixon was a great one for doing something. I think, in retrospect, we now know it would have been better to do nothing, but he was in favor of doing something.
I was there, and I opposed them. Wage and price controls, you could see analytically, would get you in a lot of trouble.
Time has come for a new economic policy for the United States. Its targets are unemployment, inflation.
At one point, President Nixon spoke up and quoted Nikita Khrushchev. And he said, Khrushchev once told me that sometimes in order to be a statesman, you have to be a politician for a while.
The problem with him was that he was willing to sacrifice principle too easily for political advantage.
The voters liked the president's war on prices. Nixon was reelected in a landslide. The economy did less well.
Right away, the economy went out of whack. People couldn't cover their costs. Ranchers stopped sending cattle to market. Farmers started drowning their chickens. Instead of controlling inflation, they were creating shortages.
And prices just kept on rising.
The last time I saw Nixon in the Oval Office was George Shultz. President Nixon said to me, "Don't blame George for this silly business of wage and price control," meaning George Shultz. And I said to him, "Oh no, Mr. President, I don't blame George. I blame you."
Well, as we can see, in the early 1970s, the United States had a huge mess on its hands. What we're about to take a look at is the problem of stagflation that we addressed a couple of lectures ago. We'll take a look at the Phillips curve to remind you of what it was supposed to say about the macroeconomy, and we'll take a look at why those chickens met their imminent demise at the hands of wage and price controls under the Nixon administration. Well, Hayek's predictions began to come true in 1971, where the cumulative effects of rising taxes, and in particular regulations, this is very important, and you'll see this when you examine the airline industry in the Commanding Heights video series, when we're talking about regulation, for example, the Roosevelt administration, to eliminate booms and busts in the economy, decided in effect to largely take over the airline industry, determine the number of airlines that could fly, which routes they could fly, and the government actually set the prices. Even when I was a kid in the 1970s, the government still determined the number of airlines, the prices they could charge, and where they could fly. Not surprisingly, it was extremely expensive to fly. The same was true in the natural gas industry, the trucking industry. It had been true in banking, in cable television. I mean, you have to recall in the phone industry when it was heavily regulated. It used to be that all the phones, if you wanted a phone, you had to get one from Bell Telephone, and it was black, and long-distance phone calls were very, very expensive. So the economy during this period of time, I mean, when you'd go to Washington, D.C. before the Roosevelt administration came in the 1930s, before Roosevelt, you would see the White House and the Capitol building and the Supreme Court, but all of a sudden we had the Department of Transportation, Department of Commerce, eventually Department of Education, Department of Energy, Department of the Interior. So all of these buildings you now see in Washington, D.C. are made up of thousands and thousands of people who make, on average, 70,000 pages, new pages of rules and regulations that you're going to have to abide by if you ever run a business or if you attempt to do anything as an individual. So every year, on average, 70,000 pages of new rules. Well, to Hayek, the rules on who can exist as a business, what they can charge, where they can operate, these rules over time raise the cost of doing business. And it also makes businesses less productive because it makes it harder for them to focus on serving their fellow man when they're having to meet so many regulations, many of which do not pass cost-benefit tests at all. So we had this particular problem of regulation compounded with taxes and government largely running many of the key industries of the United States of America, where by the time 1971 came along, aggregate supply had begun to decrease. We'll call this aggregate supply in 1971. And as you recall, reading his newspaper, Hayek saw for the first time that, we'll call this CPI 1971, GDP 1971, for the first time, something that would have been impossible, as you heard Milton Friedman say. The problem of rising unemployment and rising inflation was plaguing Great Britain and the United States of America. Well, the Keynesians had no answer for this particular problem. It was brand new. At least it was given a name. The phrase stagflation, stag comes from the economy being stagnant, being in a recession. And of course, flation comes from the economy experiencing inflation. So at least they named it, but they didn't have a solution for it. If we go back to the Phillips curve for just a moment, remember Professor Phillips, in examining historical data on the trade-off between unemployment and inflation, had found that if you have more inflation, you have less unemployment. If you have more unemployment, you have less inflation. But all of a sudden now, in 1971, we had both high rates of inflation and high rates of unemployment. Well, you will recall from reading chapter 4 of your book, whenever an observation, statistically speaking, is several standard deviations away from what is normal, and this line here represents what had been normal, it is called a statistical outlier, and economists, mathematicians, statisticians say you just ignore it. It's just it's like look at the relationship between smoking and life expectancy, and you see a negative relationship between the two, and then you have somebody like George Burns who smokes until he's 100. Okay, so statistical outliers, we're told, just ignore them because they're not part of what is normal in our economy. Well, the problem here is it's hard to ignore it when you have such a terrible economic crisis taking place and the voters want action. It's also hard to ignore it, jumping ahead a little bit, where we saw in 1973 and in 1979 and in 1980, all of a sudden we're getting this cluster of several years in a row of high inflation and high unemployment. So if it happens more than once, if it happens repeatedly, now we have a new way of looking at the economy, and we cannot say that this Phillips curve is going to hold true in all circumstances because we're now seeing several observations where the problem of stagflation is very real. Jumping over for a moment to the market for chickens. The stagflation, taxes, regulation, government control of industry, meant, of course, at the individual level that higher input costs, and remember in Chapter 7, an increase in input costs for an individual seller, in this case a chicken farmer, higher input costs leads to a decrease in supply and now the need to charge higher prices for chickens, and of course that would lead to fewer people being able to afford chicken dinners. If the economy had been left alone, this is what would have happened. Prices would have gone up and people would have had to adjust in their diets. But the Nixon administration had to do something. And so the Nixon administration came up with the idea of imposing price controls on the entire economy. You recall in Chapter 8, if you impose a price ceiling, let's go to the chicken market for just a moment. If you impose a price ceiling below equilibrium, and P2 in the chicken market is now equilibrium, so if you have a price ceiling here, you're going to get quantity supplied right here, quantity supplied. Quantity demanded will be here. So now instead of Q1, we have quantity demanded. And you recall it leads to a shortage. And you heard that on the videotape. You saw it for yourself. If your input costs are going up and now the government tells you you cannot cover your higher input costs by putting controls on what you can charge for chickens, if it costs you $4 to raise a chicken and you're allowed to charge $2.50 for it, you can see a rational response, cruel, but a rational response on the part of the chicken farmers was to say, okay, we can't afford to raise as many chickens, so the quantity of chickens supplied went down. The voters you saw were very happy with price controls because they perceive that they're going to be able to afford chicken. Now the voters are going in the grocery store, they're looking for chickens and they can hardly find any. Okay, so we have quantity demanded greater than quantity supplied in the market for chickens and a shortage of chickens. But price controls on the entire economy, if we just put this, if we put price ceilings here in the macro economy, you see the same result. Here, this would be the quantity of aggregate goods and services supplied. Over here would be the quantity of aggregate goods and services demanded. So if you have quantity supplied here and quantity demanded here for the entire economy, you're going to end up with a problem of shortages. I recall growing up in Hugo, Oklahoma, I recall in the early 70s, we lived in a town of less than 5,000 people. And I remember sitting in the back of my mom and dad's car waiting in long gas lines in this little bitty town to get to a Texaco gas station. And I remember my father complaining, and of course I was 8 years old, so I didn't know what he was complaining about. But he was complaining about the shortages that had not existed before, would not have existed without the wage and price controls. But now, instead of letting the economy's natural forces work things out where prices go up and then my father had to decide how much gas to buy, government interference in the entire economy, when Nixon declared he's now a Keynesian, ended up leading to shortages all over the United States of America. And you'll see in the Commanding Heights videotape that the British government implemented the same policies with the exact same results. So John Maynard Keynes, by the way, in fairness to him, he never wrote about the problem of stagflation because he passed away in the 60s, and the problem of stagflation didn't start taking place until 71, magnified by the Arab oil embargo of 73, magnified even more by the oil crises surrounding the Iranian Revolution in 1979 and 80. So he wasn't around to suggest wage and price controls, but remember, the Keynesian economists believed that it was government that needed to fix problems. So there would have been no reason for Richard Nixon to go on television and tell the American people, look, we have this problem of stagflation right now, but we're going to leave it alone and it'll fix itself. A decrease in the supply of oil in 1973 will be met by other people or other businesses exploring for oil somewhere else, and eventually supply will increase and prices will go down, so just be patient. When you're a politician, many times you can't afford to be patient because the voters aren't going to be patient. So when Nixon declared he was a Keynesian, what he meant was he was declaring that we were going to have government intervention in the marketplace to try to fix a macroeconomic problem. Well, the 1970s ended up being a disaster in the United States of America and Great Britain. We saw constant stagflation over this period of time. We ended up having double-digit inflation and double-digit unemployment by the early 1980s. So it began a debate, a renewal of the debate between Hayek, who you recall had largely fallen out of favor. He wrote The Road to Serfdom in 1944. 30 years later, in 1974, he won the Nobel Prize in economics. So all of a sudden, people were starting to take a look at his body of work, and they were starting to realize that the Austrian school had a lot more to say about macroeconomic policy than it had been given credit for. And so when Hayek won the Nobel Prize and his views began to become more popular once again as the economy became worse and worse, we started to see politicians campaigning for drastic economic reform that would take us away from the Keynesian school of thought. The politician in Great Britain that did this was Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. You will see in the Commanding Heights video series, in fact, I've separated one of those very important chapters out in the course website entitled The Economics of Privatization. You'll see that Margaret Thatcher, when she became Prime Minister in Great Britain, after saying that Hayek was going to be the economist they were going to follow, you'll see that she adopted the Hayek philosophy of getting the government out of the economy as much as possible. Mrs. Thatcher began to privatize key industries in Great Britain, dramatically cut subsidies for businesses, cut welfare payments for individuals, began the process of reducing regulations and reducing taxes. And at first, she was vilified for being cruel and uncaring. And she made it very clear that in the long run, Great Britain would be better off with less government involvement in the economy. We'll get back to her in just a moment. In the United States of America, Ronald Reagan campaigned in 1980 on the exact same economic ideology of Hayek and Adam Smith and Bastiat, that government should, as he said, get off the backs of the American people. What I want to mention to you in this fight against stagflation is that Reagan was helped a great deal by an economist by the name of Arthur Laffer. Arthur Laffer was an economics professor, a very young gentleman in the late 1970s at the University of Southern California. And one day, he was having lunch with some of his friends, and they were discussing all that was ailing the American economy. When Art Laffer pulled out, as the story goes, a cocktail napkin, and he drew what has become one of the most famous diagrams in the history of economic thought. If we put tax revenue on the vertical axis and tax rates on the horizontal axis, and we can do it here as well, we'll just put revenue and rates. Historically, the perception that existed among economists, many of them anyway, was that there was a positive relationship between the tax rates a government charges businesses and individuals and the revenue that it takes in. It seems to be a simple enough case. Let's say the government charged all of us a 10% tax rate and it took in R1 level of revenue. If the government said, look, we are facing a budget crisis right now, or we've got a war that we're trying to fight, or the senior citizens are aging, we need more revenue, if the government increased the amount they took from you to 20%, well, you're going to end up sending in 20% and the government will get greater revenue. So think about it. Every time you hear politicians talk about the need for more police, fire, better roads, whatever, they talk about raising property taxes, raising sales taxes. Right now in 2010, the debate is on raising income taxes, capital gains taxes, healthcare taxes, estate taxes. We covered that last time, to pay for the budget deficit that's growing by leaps and bounds. And whenever you hear people advocate tax cuts, you'll often hear politicians say, I remember once hearing Hillary Clinton say, we can't afford a tax cut at this time. Well, her saying we can't afford it seems to presuppose two things. Number one, it seems to suggest that maybe politicians think that your money's really their money because they're saying we can't afford it. I mean, I know when I tell my kids we can't afford something, I'm talking about my own money. So maybe it suggests that politicians think that it's their money. But to be fair to her, what she's really most likely saying is that when we say we can't afford a tax cut, is that if you cut taxes, revenue is going to go down and you won't be able to fund the military and Social Security and things like this. Well, Laffer argued that this perceived relationship between rates and revenue was only half right. He argued that the real relationship between tax rates and tax revenue is convex. He said, if the government taxes us at 0%, the government will get no money. If the government taxes us at, say, 5%, it will get R1. If it taxes us at 12%, perhaps it will get R2. And the government can keep raising taxes. We'll call this TR star, tax rate star. And it will end up yielding, we'll call this R star, yielding revenue at a maximum level at this point here. So Laffer argued that it's true for a while. As you raise the tax rate, revenue will go up. After all, you've got to work. If the government took 5 or 8 or 12% of your money, you would still get to keep most of your money, and I doubt any of you would quit or start hiring accountants to hide from a 12% income tax rate. But Laffer argued there reaches a point where if you begin taxing beyond a certain level, whether it's for the poor, the middle class, or the rich, if we get out here to, in the extreme case, Ronald Reagan mentioned the 94% tax bracket he was in. You also recall Reagan said that after a while he didn't want to make movies. And he mentioned that by not making these movies, it led to less revenue government collected from him and other people that did not get to make those movies as well. The same, you could argue, would be the tax rate that Kennedy inherited, or the tax rate of 70%. Recall, as recently as 1981, the most highly productive Americans sent 70% of their income to the federal government in the form of taxation. Well, Laffer argued that when you get out to this level of taxation, tax revenue starts to go down, and it starts to go down because it creates disincentives for people to work. He would argue that among the poor, if they perceive that their taxes are too high, and remember, at the time I'm delivering this lecture, the lowest marginal income tax rate is 10%. That's set to go up to 15% in 2011. If lower income individuals believe that their taxes are too high, according to Laffer and the neoclassical or supply-side economists that became very popular in the 1980s, that poor people will start to work off the books for cash. Maybe they'll combine working for cash with working for some jobs in the above-ground economy where they actually are taxed. Maybe some might decide not to work at all, deciding that social welfare benefits are now more profitable than work. I mean, after all, if you're working, it's just not just taxes. It's dealing with your boss. It's the cost of dry cleaning and gas and tolls and maybe eating lunches. There's a daycare cost for your children. If you believe your net pay is lower than what you could get from being on welfare or for working in the informal economy where you work for cash and then hide it, then you're going to pursue that very rational option. And when you do that, the government, according to Laffer, collects less revenue. in the informal economy, or if you're not participating in the economy as a worker at all. Among the middle class, it creates disincentives to work overtime or to improve your productivity, get extra training, education. It can discourage people from being a two-income family because the net pay is lower, and therefore you have a less productive economy, less revenue for government. And among the wealthiest individuals, and this is where to learn this material, you have to set aside emotion, maybe envy, coveting what your neighbor has, in order to focus on the hard economic facts. When you raise taxes, according to Laffer, when you raise taxes too much on people like Bill Gates and Steve Jobs, Fred Smith, the owner of FedEx, Oprah Winfrey, whomever, that's where they begin to call the accountants with the fancy pencils and say, look, I did not get to be rich by being stupid. You need to hide as much of this income as you can, whether it's in offshore accounts, in tax-free municipal bonds, a bigger mortgage, a charitable trust, whatever the case might be. And the more money that these individuals set aside in hiding from taxation, the less money they are investing in new plants, equipment, new workers. Remember, rich people, when Bill Gates got to be worth $1 billion, he didn't quit his job because 2 billion is more than 1. And when he got to 2, 10 is more than 2. You get the idea. So these types of individuals rarely, if ever, I can't remember one, retiring and saying, I'm now fully satisfied, I'm never going to work again. They want to keep producing new goods and services to enrich themselves and, of course, ultimately to make us better off as well, and to create jobs for us working for them. So Laffer argued, no matter what income scale you're talking about, if you raise taxes too much, you will end up decreasing incentives, create the problem of tax avoidance or tax evasion. You'll have fewer jobs, fewer businesses, less research and development expenditures, and over time you will weaken the economy and the government will collect less tax revenue. Well, Reagan, in his book, An American Life, said some people call this supply-side economics. In his book, he said, I just call it common sense. And in many ways, if you think about it analytically, John F. Kennedy, you recall in his video, talked about income taxes cuts up and down the income scale. You saw Reagan advocate the same thing. So it's not about being a Democratic politician or a Republican politician. It's about being a politician that understands the case for allowing you to keep more of your own money. So what began to happen in Great Britain and the United States of America was that the governments of Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan began to adopt an economic policy that ran completely opposite of John Maynard Keynes. In effect, we'll put AD1 here. Let's just start us off at CPI 1, GDP 1. In effect, the Thatcher and Reagan governments operating under the Austrian school, and again in the 80s it was called the supply-side school of economic thought, said, forget about aggregate demand. Remember, Jean-Baptiste Say gave us the theory that became an economic law called Say's law. Supply creates demand. That we have to create incentives for the suppliers to show up. And when the suppliers show up, they have to employ people, and that creates income for people to use to purchase goods and services. So from Jean-Baptiste Say up until John Maynard Keynes, most of economic policy operated under Say's law. We have to encourage supply. During the Great Depression and running through the early 1970s, we switched our mind and we said, no, demand creates supply. Remember, the Keynesian school was all about stimulating demand. Well, when those types of policies led to stagflation, all of a sudden, around the world, people began to go back to Jean-Baptiste Say. In many ways, as big a fan as I am economically of Thatcher and Reagan and Hayek and the things they pursued, and it was called neoclassical economics, supply-side economics, Austrian economics, but in many ways it goes back to the French economist Say, who told us in 1803, look, focus on supply, increase supply, get more suppliers to show up, and your economy will grow. And so Reagan and Thatcher adopted the policy of lower taxes, regulations that passed cost-benefit tests. If you go back and do your work, and by the way, I should mention Jimmy Carter preceding Reagan deserves some credit for deregulating the airline industry and the trucking industry, but we began to see less rules and regulation in airlines, trucking, cable television, banking, the energy sector of the economy. All throughout the economy, people now were allowed to take risk and start a new trucking company or a new airline, or start a new phone company, begin the process of creating fiber optic technology. So we started to see this burst of competition and all these new suppliers entering because of less regulation, less taxes. And as I mentioned, in Great Britain, we began to see government selling off the coal industry, railroad industry that it run since World War II to private companies who, if you think about the comparison between the post office and FedEx, the private companies were much more efficient, provided things at a much lower cost, and ultimately created a lot more jobs as they began to expand. What ended up happening as a result of going back to the Austrian and the supply side school of thought was that we started to see a dramatic drop in the input costs of working for the individual, a dramatic drop in the input costs of supplying goods and services as a business. We began to see a tremendous increase in productivity in businesses and individuals. In your macroeconomics book, all of the data is there for the United States on productivity, inflation, unemployment, the GDP, all of these things. As we saw improvements in productivity, improvements in technological progress, and again, the productivity came from now businesses thinking, I'm paying less in taxes. Remember, Reagan came in and the top tax rate was 70% in 1981. By 1986, the top tax rate was 28%. Well, this freed up resources for businesses to invest in better technology, better productivity, expand their plants and operations, hire more people. It expanded the opportunity for workers to work overtime, take a second job, improve their education skills and training so they could keep more of their own money. And as a result, the lower input costs, better productivity, better technology, and more individuals and businesses entering the labor market. Remember, the third determinant of aggregate supply is the quantity of inputs. Ladies, I should mention, the biggest increase in female labor participation rates took place in the 1980s, when now husband and wife combined income was taxed at a low rate instead of a high rate, and now we started to see more women employing their productive resources in the labor market. All of this led to a tremendous expansion of aggregate supply over time. So we ended up going from point A to point B, and as a result, during the 1980s, we saw a decrease in inflation and an increase in the gross domestic product. To be even more accurate, when the economy began to grow on the supply side and there were more workers and more income being created, we also began to see an increase in aggregate demand, AD2. So if you want to carry this out to its more logical conclusion of what we saw during the 80s, we can come out to point C, where you still have, even at CPI 3, GDP 3, you still have a lower rate of inflation than point A and a greater level of gross domestic product than at point A or point B. So this is the non-inflationary economic growth that we talked about in Chapter 11 when we were examining changes in aggregate demand and aggregate supply. And this is the precise picture of what took place in the United States of America during this period of time. Going forward, I should mention a bit some other key figures in this type of economic policy and some of the other things that the supply-side economists recommend to deal with an economy that's experiencing stagflation or any other economic problem. We had a setback to this under the first Bush administration when, in 1990, President Bush signed legislation, the 1990 Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act, which at that time was the largest tax increase in the history of the United States of America. He signed it into law in the fall of 1990. Not surprisingly, the economy went into a recession that lasted until the spring of 1991. And Bush, largely as a result of that recession that we went into and very sluggishly grew out of, lost the election to President Clinton in 1992. When President Clinton came into office, we saw an even bigger income tax increase that gave us the 39.6 top marginal tax rate. But then in 1994, we saw the Democratic Party get trounced in the midterm congressional elections, and the Republicans of Newt Gingrich and others that were borrowing heavily from the Reagan playbook, not the first Bush playbook, convinced the American people to, look, we need to go back and do what we did during the 1980s to make the economy grow again. Well, if you look at Bill Clinton's track record from 1994 until he left office, because he got, of course, reelected in 1996, we saw significant cuts in the capital gains income tax rate. We saw the creation of the Roth IRA, which allowed you to save more money and not have to pay taxes on it. Taxes on the profit from the sale of your house. It used to be that you had to pay 28% on the profit. Now, if you live in your house for 2 years, the tax rate is 0. That's legislation that Bill Clinton signed. So we saw during the second part of the time Bill Clinton was in office, we actually saw significant tax reform when it came to especially capital gains taxes for the American people. Going forward into the Bush administration, we did see a reduction in marginal income tax rates to the rates that still in 2010 that we're paying now. But we also saw a tremendous increase in government spending that most economists believe are going to end up offsetting the tax cuts we got under Bush. And of course, today we are embroiled in the debate where President Obama has made it very clear that he believes a big part of the reason why we went into recession in 07, 08, 09 and are still so sluggish today is because of the tax cuts that you've seen many times. You can YouTube it for yourself. He argued that the tax cuts gave the wealthy too many advantages and promoted unfairness in the tax code. And he argues that somehow that taxes that were lowered for everybody, but especially helped the rich, according to President Obama, ended up being at the root of the economic crises that we're facing today. Kennedy would not agree. Reagan would not agree. The economic data from the 60s, if we look at the results of the Kennedy cuts and the 80s of the Reagan cuts, even the Bush and Clinton tax cuts. When Clinton cut capital gains taxes, check it for yourself. Capital gains tax revenue went up dramatically because people invested more in new businesses. When Bush's income tax rates fell, we saw an increase in tax revenue, not a decrease, and the economy picked up steam as a result of these tax cuts. So we're still embroiled in this debate. The Keynesians have made a return. In fact, if we see, even under George W. Bush, he once said, "I'm a Keynesian and a supply-sider." Well, that's like saying I'm a carnivore and a vegetarian, okay? That just doesn't work. And we saw the supply side part of his policies with respect to the tax cuts, but we certainly saw the Keynesian side as well, where he became the first president since the 1800s to not veto one spending bill while he was president. So we did get the Keynesian stuff of tremendous increases in government spending, which has sown the seeds for where we are today with these runaway deficits and national debt. But we got some supply side stuff too. The problem is over time, you have to pick, okay? You're either a Keynesian or a supply sider. If you cut taxes but then let government spending explode, you're going to see the same type of problems that Hayek predicted in 1944. I should mention in closing that the Austrian school of economic thought, the supply-siders, are not just limited to the discussion of taxes on income and capital gains, regulation, and what have you. The Austrian school would also advocate greater free trade. I encourage you to take a look at your chapter on international trade to learn more as to why international trade, free trade without burdensome tariffs and quotas, improves productivity, lowers costs, and makes the economy grow. The supply-side economists and the Austrian school tend to be more in favor of open immigration than many of the folks who are debating this right now. They would argue that at the lowest income spectrum, if we get low-skilled immigrants coming into the country who will do jobs that in many cases Americans will not do, that keeps downward pressure on the cost of everything from roofing houses to working in the agricultural fields, and that helps stimulate aggregate supply. Certainly at the top end, the more mathematicians and scientists that we can allow to come in from India, China, Eastern Europe, wherever, to offset the shortage of Americans who can do the math and the science, the more of those folks we get in here, the greater aggregate supply will be. And I should also mention, and this may end up being one of the most important Austrian or supply-side policy recommendations going forward. When we look at the quality of K through 12 education in the United States of America, and in chapters 4 and 5 in the videos that you watched, in the book, the book material that you read, and other things that you covered to help convince yourself, if you look at K through 12 education in the United States of America, we are in big trouble and have been in big trouble since the government largely took over education, where we see kids who are able to get vouchers, kids who go to private schools, kids who are homeschooled. We tend to have far greater performance in school, and those types of students end up being much more productive and much more able to earn high levels of income. When we look at the quality of education that many people in Europe and India and China are getting compared to the United States, we rank very, very low in the quality of K through 12 education in this country, largely because parents don't have school choice. And we have choice in every other areas of our lives, cell phones, food, homes, whatever the case might be, but largely because we do something unique where in other countries they attach your taxes to you and allow you to pick whatever school you want. In America, we have the school district if you're not a homeschooler or a private school parent. And no matter how good or bad the local school is, in many cases you have to go there. And without competition and heavy unionization of the schools in our country, heavy payments more towards administration than to the classroom, we've seen a further erosion in the quality of education. Well, in the long run, I'd like for you to think clearly about what this is going to do to aggregate supply in the United States of America. If our education system continues to erode while other countries make improvements, we're going to continue to see a drop in labor productivity. We're going to see higher input costs. And if we keep skilled folks out of this country in the wake of 9/11 and being more careful about who comes in, it's going to put tremendous strain on aggregate supply. And I would like to suggest to you, between our education system, between the government now, in essence, quasi-nationalizing parts of the automotive industry, the healthcare industry, especially the banking industry, same sort of things that governments did during World War II, with the push for higher taxes over time and greater regulation that businesses and individuals are now facing, I would suggest going forward for the rest of this decade that you're going to hear a lot more about the problem of stagflation popping up, and that's going to intensify this debate between the Hayek economists who championed the politicians like Reagan and Thatcher, second term Bill Clinton, the politicians of now in the Czech Republic and Estonia. You're going to see the debate intensify between the Hayek economists and the Keynesian economists as to what to do about the problem of stagflation. I hope this is not the case, but we're seeing all indications that going forward, the problem of stagflation may begin to rear its ugly head once again. And I can tell you, you do not want to go back to the 1970s and the types of economic conditions that we had during that period of time. This concludes the macroeconomics material for chapters 12 and 13. I trust that your reading is going well and that you will contact me if you're having any problems with this material. Good luck in your studies and have a good day.